Some things don't leave you even when you leave them. The relationship. The job. The mistake you keep replaying at 2 a.m. You go through the motions. You show up. You smile when you're supposed to. But something in your chest won't quiet down. Something that's been sitting there so long. You've almost stopped noticing how heavy it is. And the strange part? The thing that's weighing you down isn't always pain. Sometimes it's a story you've been telling yourself for so long. That letting go of it would mean letting go of who you think you are. So the real question isn't how do you move on, it's why letting go feels more dangerous than the thing that's killing you inside. We'll get into why your mind keeps replaying things you've already lived through. Then why forgiveness has nothing to do with the other person, and everything to do with you. But here's where it gets uncomfortable, why the pain you're holding on to might actually be protecting you. And finally, the one shift that makes letting go feel possible, instead of terrifying. This is Book Echo English, where we break down the most important ideas from books so they actually stick. If that sounds like something you need, stay with us. There's a moment most people have had. Something ended, a relationship, a friendship, a version of your life. You thought you'd have forever. And you told yourself you were over it. Weeks passed. Maybe months. But then a song comes on, or you drive past a familiar place. And suddenly it's all right there again, as sharp and heavy as the day it happened. And you think, why is my brain doing this to me? Here's what's actually happening. Your brain has one job above everything else, keep you alive. And to do that, it has to learn from danger. So when something causes you significant emotional pain, your brain doesn't file it away like a regular memory. It flags it. Keeps it close to the surface. Makes sure you can access it quickly. Because as far as your brain is concerned, that situation was a threat, and threats need to be remembered. The problem is your brain can't always tell the difference between a threat that's still happening and one that's already over. So it keeps the memory active. Keeps replaying it. Not to torture you, but because it genuinely believes it's protecting you from something that might happen again. Think of it like a car alarm that went off during a break-in. The break-in is over. The thief is gone. But the alarm is still going. Because nobody told it the danger had passed. That's what rumination is at its core. It's not weakness. It's not you being stuck on purpose. It's a protection system that never received the signal to stand down. And this is where it gets important. Because most people try to fix this by forcing themselves not to think about it. They distract themselves. Stay busy. Push it down. But here's the thing about a car alarm. Covering it with a pillow doesn't turn it off. It just muffles it. The moment you stop distracting yourself, at night, in the quiet, the alarm starts again. Because the underlying signal was never addressed. What your brain actually needs isn't distraction. It needs completion. It needs to process the event fully enough that it can finally categorize it as over. Not as an ongoing threat that requires constant monitoring. That's the difference between people who seem to move on naturally and people who stay stuck for years. It's not that some people feel less. It's that some people, usually without even realizing it, allow themselves to fully feel it. They sit with the discomfort instead of running from it. And in doing that, they give their brain the signal it's been waiting for. The threat is gone. You can rest now. Most people never get that signal. Not because they're broken. But because nobody taught them that feeling it fully is the only way to actually finish it. And that brings up something most people never consider. Because it's not just about what happened to you. Sometimes what you're holding on to isn't even the event itself. It's what the event made you believe about who you are. And that's a completely different problem. One that's much harder to see, and much harder to let go of. Think about someone who went through a bad breakup years ago. They're fine now, mostly. But every new relationship, they're waiting for it to fall apart. Every moment of happiness carries this quiet dread underneath it. And if you ask them why, they probably couldn't fully explain it. They'd just say, "I've been hurt before. I'm being careful." But that's not the whole story. At some point during that breakup, or whatever their painful event was, they didn't just experience loss. They formed a conclusion. About themselves. About people. About how life works. Maybe it was, "I'm not enough." Maybe it was, "People always leave." Maybe it was, "Trusting someone always ends in pain." And that conclusion quietly became part of their identity. This is the part nobody talks about. Because it's uncomfortable to look at directly. When something painful happens to us, we don't just grieve the loss. We build a story around it. A story that explains why it happened. What it means about us. And how we should move through the world to make sure it never happens again. And for a while, that story feels protective. It feels like wisdom. But here's the problem. That story needs the pain to stay valid. If you fully heal, if you genuinely let go, the story loses its foundation. And if the story loses its foundation, a part of your identity goes with it. So your mind does something quietly devastating. It keeps the wound open. Not because it wants you to suffer, but because some part of you has built a home inside that suffering. Decorated it. Gotten comfortable. The pain became familiar, and familiar feels safe. Even when it's destroying you. You can see this pattern everywhere once you know to look for it. The person who describes themselves as someone who's always been unlucky. The one who says they're just not the kind of person who gets close to people. The one who calls themselves broken like it's a personality trait. These aren't just coping phrases. They're identities built on unprocessed pain. And they're incredibly hard to release. Because releasing them requires admitting something unsettling. That the story you've been telling yourself might not be true. That you've been carrying a conclusion. Formed during your worst moment. And applying it to every moment since. The psychologist Dan McAdams spent decades studying what he called personal narrative. The story each of us tells about who we are and how we got here. His research found that people don't just remember their past. They construct it, shaping events into a story. That confirms what they already believe about themselves. Which means if you believe you're someone who gets hurt, your brain will find the evidence to prove it. Not because you're pessimistic, but because that's how narrative identity works. The story protects itself. So letting go of pain isn't just an emotional process. It's an identity process. It requires you to ask, who am I without this story? What do I believe about myself when I remove the wound from the equation? And that question is terrifying for most people. Because the story, as painful as it is, at least feels known. What comes after it feels like open water. But here's what most people never realize. The thing you've been guarding yourself from isn't more pain. It's the emotions that have been sitting underneath the story the whole time. And your body has been holding them there. Waiting for you to be ready. There's a study that most people find unsettling when they first hear it. Researchers asked two groups of people not to think about a white bear. One group was told to suppress the thought actively, push it away, don't let it in. The other group was told to just let their mind go wherever it went. The suppression group thought about the white bear significantly more. Not less. That's the irony of emotional suppression in one experiment. Most of us were taught, either directly or through watching the adults around us, that difficult emotions are meant to be managed. Controlled. Kept in check. You don't cry in public. You don't let them see you angry. You process it privately, then you move on. And so we learn to push things down. To function. To appear fine. And we got very good at it. But here's what was actually happening underneath. Your body processes emotion the same way it processes physical experience. When something happens, a shock, a loss, a humiliation, your nervous system responds. Stress hormones release. Your heart rate changes. Your muscles tighten. Your body is literally preparing to deal with a threat. Now if that emotional energy gets expressed, if you cry, if you talk about it, if you allow yourself to fully feel it, the cycle completes. The nervous system comes back to baseline. But if you suppress it, if you cut the expression off before it finishes, the energy doesn't disappear. It stays in the body in a kind of suspended state. Stored. Waiting. The researcher Peter Levine spent years studying trauma, and found that animals in the wild rarely develop lasting trauma responses, even after genuinely life-threatening events. Because after the threat passes, they physically discharge the energy. They shake. They shiver. They run. The nervous system completes its cycle and resets. Humans interrupt that process. Because we've been taught that shaking, crying, expressing is weakness, is losing control, is inappropriate. So we hold it in. And what we hold in, we carry. You can feel this if you think about it honestly. That tightness in your chest when a certain topic comes up. The way your jaw clenches around a specific memory. The sudden exhaustion you feel when you're around a particular person. That's not emotional sensitivity. That's stored energy looking for a way out. And the longer it stays stored, the more it starts to shape things. You don't even consciously connect to it. Your sleep. Your patience. The way you respond when someone raises their voice. The reason small things sometimes set off reactions that feel disproportionate to what just happened is because they're not just responding to what just happened. They're releasing pressure that's been building for months. Sometimes years. This is why telling someone to just move on never works. You can't think your way out of something your body is holding. The mind and body aren't separate systems running parallel to each other. They're one system. And healing has to happen at both levels. The emotional weight you've been carrying isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign that something real happened to you. And your body took it seriously even when you tried not to. But there's a specific kind of suffering that sits above all of this. One that feels like processing but is actually the opposite. One that keeps you circling the same pain, while convincing you that you're working through it. And most people have no idea they're stuck in it. There's a version of thinking about your problems that feels productive. It feels like you're analyzing, processing, figuring things out. You replay the conversation. Examine what was said. Consider what you could have done differently. Think about what it means. What it says about you. What it says about them. And hours pass. And you're in the exact same place you were when you started. This is rumination. And it's one of the most misunderstood patterns in psychology. Because it wears the disguise of self-reflection so convincingly that most people never realize they're doing it. Real reflection moves. You think about something, you gain a new perspective. And that perspective changes something, how you feel, what you understand. What you decide to do next. Rumination circles. Same thoughts. Same pain. Same questions with no answers. Just dressed up as thinking. The psychologist Susan Nolan Hoeksema devoted most of her career to studying this pattern. What she found was striking. Rumination doesn't just fail to help people process pain. It actively makes it worse. People who ruminate consistently report higher levels of depression and anxiety. Not because their problems are bigger, but because the act of repetitive negative thinking deepens the neural pathways associated with distress. In simple terms, the more you replay it, the more real it feels. The more real it feels, the more you replay it. And the loop tightens. You can feel the difference between the two if you pay attention. Reflection has a quality of movement to it. Of arrival. Even when it's painful, something shifts. Rumination has a quality of spinning. You always end up back at the same point. Usually a question you can't answer. Or a conclusion that makes you feel worse about yourself. Why did they do that? Why wasn't I enough? What's wrong with me? What if I had just done things differently? These questions feel important. They feel like the key to understanding. But they're not questions your mind is actually trying to answer. They're questions your mind is using to stay inside the pain. Because staying inside the pain, as counterintuitive as it sounds, feels more controllable than stepping outside of it. At least inside the pain, you're doing something. You're trying to figure it out. Stepping away from it feels like giving up. Like letting them win. Like pretending it didn't matter. But that's a story rumination tells to keep itself running. The research shows that one of the most effective interruptions to the rumination cycle isn't thinking harder, it's moving differently. Physical movement. A change of environment. Engaging a completely different part of the brain. Not as avoidance, but as a genuine circuit breaker. That gives your nervous system a chance to reset. Before you return to the thought. Because rumination isn't a thinking problem. It's a regulation problem. Your nervous system is dysregulated. Stuck in a low-level threat response. And it's using repetitive thought as a way to feel like it's managing the situation. You can't think your way out of a dysregulated nervous system. But you can move your way into a regulated one. And from there, from that calmer state, real reflection becomes possible. The kind that actually moves something. But underneath all of this, beneath the suppression, the stories, the rumination, there's a process most people associate only with death. A process that applies to every significant loss you've ever experienced. And understanding it changes how you see everything you've been carrying. When most people hear the word grief, they picture a funeral. A loss so final and so obvious that everyone around you acknowledges it. People bring food. They check in on you. The world gives you permission to fall apart for a while. But most of the losses that quietly destroy people never get that permission. The relationship that ended but wasn't a marriage. The career you gave years to that collapsed overnight. The friendship that just faded without explanation. The version of your future you had to silently bury. When life went a different direction. Nobody brings food for those losses. Nobody tells you to take time to grieve. And so most people don't. They just keep moving. Keep functioning. And wonder why something that happened years ago still feels unfinished. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross introduced the 5 stages of grief. In the late 1960s, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Most people have heard of them. But what most people don't know is that Kubler-Ross herself, later in her life, clarified that these stages were never meant to be linear. They're not a staircase you climb in order. They're a weather system. They come and go. Overlap. Return when you least expect them. And they apply to any significant loss. Not just death. This matters because most people evaluate their healing by asking, "Am I over it yet?" As if healing is a destination you arrive at and then stay at permanently. But that's not how grief works. You don't get over a significant loss. You integrate it. It becomes part of you in a way that stops being painful and starts being just, true. Think about someone who lost a business they built from nothing. On paper they moved on. Started something new. Life continued. But every time they hear about someone else's success, there's a quiet sting. A flash of something unresolved. They'd probably call it jealousy. But underneath the jealousy is grief. That never got acknowledged as grief. Because we don't have a cultural framework for grieving things that aren't death. We have frameworks for moving on, for being resilient, for not letting it define you, but not for sitting with a loss and saying, "This mattered. This ending was real. I'm allowed to feel the weight of it." And that acknowledgement, that simple, quiet act of validation, is often the thing that starts the actual movement. Not therapy. Not time. Not distraction. Just the moment you stop calling it something smaller than it was. The research on what's called ambiguous loss, losses without closure, without clear endings, shows consistently that the absence of acknowledgement is one of the primary reasons people stay stuck. Not the loss itself. The silence around it. When something is named, it can be processed. When it's minimized, when you tell yourself it wasn't that big a deal. Other people have it worse, I should be over this by now. It goes underground. And underground, it doesn't disappear. It just becomes harder to find and harder to move. Give your losses their real names. Not to dwell in them, but because you can't release something you've never allowed yourself to fully hold. And once you start seeing your pain clearly, once you stop minimizing it and start understanding it, you'll inevitably arrive at one of the most misunderstood ideas in the entire conversation around healing. One that most people get completely backwards. And getting it backwards keeps them stuck longer than almost anything else. When most people think about forgiveness, they picture a conversation. A moment where the person who hurt you finally understands what they did, finally apologizes, finally takes responsibility. And in that moment, you forgive them. The wound closes. You both move forward. It's a clean story. And it almost never happens that way. Because the people who hurt you most are often the least likely to acknowledge it. Some of them don't even remember it the way you do. Some of them have rewritten the story entirely. Cast themselves as the reasonable one, the misunderstood one, the one who was also hurting. And if forgiveness requires their participation, if it requires the apology, the acknowledgement, the moment of closure, then for most people, it simply never comes. They wait. Sometimes for years. Holding the wound open, keeping the case active. Waiting for a verdict that was never going to arrive. Here's what forgiveness actually is. It has nothing to do with the other person. It's not something you give them. It's not absolution. It's not saying what happened was okay. It's not reconciliation. It's not even something they need to know about. Forgiveness is a decision you make for yourself. To stop spending your own energy maintaining the case against someone else. Think about what holding a grudge actually requires. You have to keep the memory active. Keep rehearsing the injustice. Keep feeling the anger fresh enough to justify the position. It takes real psychological energy to maintain that. Energy that is entirely yours. Energy that is not touching the person you're angry at in any way. While you're replaying the argument at 3 a.m. They're asleep. While you're carrying the weight of what they did. They've moved on. The grudge lives in you. Not in them. It was never in them. Lewis Smedes, one of the most cited researchers on the psychology of forgiveness, described it this way. When you forgive someone, you set a prisoner free. And then discover the prisoner was you. That line lands differently when you actually sit with it. Because most people resist forgiveness. Not because they don't understand it intellectually. But because forgiving feels like losing. Like the other person gets away with it. Like your pain gets erased. Like you're handing them a victory they don't deserve. But that framing has the power dynamic completely backwards. Holding on is not power. It's a chain. And the person on the other end of that chain isn't even holding it. You are. On both ends. Forgiveness doesn't mean the relationship gets restored. It doesn't mean you forget. It doesn't mean you expose yourself to the same situation again. It means you withdraw your energy from a wound that has been feeding on that energy to stay alive. Some wounds only stay open because you keep returning to them. Because the anger feels justified, and it probably is justified. Because the pain was real, and it absolutely was real. But justified anger, held long enough, stops punishing the person who caused it, and starts punishing the person who's carrying it. That's the moment forgiveness stops being about them, and starts being about your own survival. And once you understand what forgiveness actually costs, and what holding on actually costs, you start to see something even more counterintuitive. The thing you've been gripping tightest, the control you've been refusing to surrender, is the exact thing standing between you and the only kind of peace that actually lasts. There's a particular kind of suffering that comes not from what happened to you, but from the gap between what happened and what you needed to happen instead. That gap is where most people live. Not in the present. In the distance between reality and the version of reality they're still trying to negotiate with. If I had said something different. If they had just understood. If it had gone the way it was supposed to. And underneath every one of those thoughts is the same impulse, control. The belief that if you think about it enough, replay it enough, analyze it enough, you can somehow reach back into what already happened and change the outcome. You can't. You know you can't. But the mind keeps trying anyway. Because surrendering that effort feels like accepting something unbearable. It feels like admitting that things can happen to you that you had no power over. That the world doesn't bend to your understanding of how it should work. And that realization, truly felt, not just intellectually understood, is one of the most disorienting experiences a person can have. Here's the paradox nobody prepares you for. The tighter you grip something you can't control, the more out of control your inner world becomes. Because you're pouring enormous energy into a direction that has no return. Trying to control the uncontrollable doesn't give you stability. It drains the energy you need for the things you actually can influence. The Stoics understood this distinction with unusual clarity. Epictetus, who was born a slave and had almost no control over the external circumstances of his life, built an entire philosophy around one simple division. Some things are within our power. Some things are not. The suffering, he argued, comes almost entirely from confusing the two. From treating things outside your control as if they should be within it. From demanding that the past be different. From requiring that other people behave according to your expectations. From insisting that life follow a script it was never reading from. The moment you release that demand, not suppress it, not pretend it isn't there, but genuinely release it, something unexpected happens. You don't become passive. You don't stop caring. You don't resign yourself to whatever comes. You become more effective. Because your energy stops bleeding into the uncontrollable and starts flowing into the actual present. The decisions in front of you. The people who are here. The version of your life that exists right now. Rather than the one that existed before everything changed. This is what letting go actually looks like in practice. It's not a moment of beautiful surrender. It's not a meditation breakthrough or a dramatic emotional release. It's the quiet, repeated decision to redirect your attention from what you can't change to what you can. Again and again. Every time the mind drifts back. Not as punishment, but as practice. The people who seem to have genuinely moved on from hard things aren't people who felt less. They're not stronger or less sensitive or somehow built differently. They're people who stopped fighting the reality of what happened and started working with the reality of what is. That shift, from resisting what was to engaging with what is where actual freedom begins. Not the freedom of having everything go your way, but the freedom of no longer needing it to. And there's one final piece to this. Something most people never consider. Because it sounds too simple to be the answer. But if you've made it this far, you deserve to hear the thing that quietly makes everything else possible. If you've made it this far, you're already ahead of most people. Here's the thing nobody tells you about letting go. You don't actually do it. Not in the way we talk about it. This clean, decisive release where you put something down and walk away from it lighter. That's not how the mind works. You can't create emptiness in a mind that's always running. You can't just remove something and leave nothing in its place. Nature doesn't allow a vacuum. And neither does your psychology. Every attempt to simply stop thinking about something, to just let it go, move on, leave it behind, fails eventually. Not because you're weak, but because you're trying to do something the mind is structurally incapable of doing. What actually works is replacement. Not distraction, that's just postponement. Not suppression, we already know where that goes. Replacement. Deliberately, intentionally filling the space that the old thought, the old pain, the old story occupied with something that requires your genuine attention and energy. Here's why this works at the neurological level. Your brain operates on what neuroscientists call competitive plasticity. Neural pathways compete for dominance. The ones that get used strengthen. The ones that get ignored weaken. When you ruminate, you're strengthening the pathways associated with that pain, making them faster, more automatic, easier to fall into. But when you consistently redirect your attention to something that genuinely engages you, a skill you're building, a relationship you're investing in, a problem you're actively solving, you're strengthening different pathways. Not erasing the old ones, but outcompeting them. Over time, the new pathways become the default. The old ones don't disappear, but they become like an overgrown road. Still there, but no longer where you automatically go. This is what every person who has genuinely healed from something significant has done, usually without realizing it. They didn't let go. They replaced. They found something that mattered enough to pull their attention forward, more powerfully than the pain pulled it backward. The replacement doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be a new passion or a life transformation. It can be something small and consistent. A daily practice, a creative outlet, a physical discipline. A relationship you start showing up to more fully. The only requirement is that it's real. That it genuinely engages you rather than just occupying time. Because your mind knows the difference. You can sit in front of a television for hours and still be completely inside the pain. Passive consumption doesn't replace, it just pauses. Active engagement replaces. Because active engagement requires the same mental resources. That rumination runs on. You can't fully do both at the same time. And here's how this ties everything together. The reason the brain replays what it does, topic 1. The reason identity attaches to pain, topic 2. The reason suppression stores instead of releases, topic 3. The reason rumination loops without resolving, topic 4. The reason grief needs acknowledgement before movement, topic 5. The reason forgiveness is an internal act, topic 6. The reason control needs to be released, topic 7. All of it points to the same underlying truth. The mind doesn't let go of what it's focused on. It lets go of what it no longer needs to focus on. Give it something worth focusing on instead. That's not a motivational line. That's the mechanism. And once you see it as a mechanism rather than a feeling, letting go stops being something you have to force yourself to do, and starts being something that quietly happens as a result of how you choose to live. What this book is really saying isn't complicated. The reason letting go feels impossible isn't weakness. It isn't failure. It's because nobody taught you what letting go actually is, or how the mind actually works when it's holding on. Your brain replays pain to protect you. Your identity wraps around it to make sense of it. Your body stores what you were never allowed to express. Rumination convinces you that circling is the same as processing. Grief, even for losses that never got acknowledged as grief, needs to be named before it can move. Forgiveness isn't something you give to someone else. It's something you do for yourself. And control, gripped tightly enough, becomes its own prison. But underneath all of it is one quiet truth. You don't force letting go. You replace what you've been holding with something worth holding instead. So here's the only thing worth trying in the next 24 hours. Not a system. Not a practice. Just one question, honestly answered. What have I been calling by a smaller name than it deserves? Name it accurately. That's where movement begins. Everything in this video pointed to one thing. The mind doesn't change by being told to. It changes by being understood. And that's exactly where the next one picks up. Because letting go of what's hurting you is only half the equation. The other half is building the kind of mind that doesn't get trapped in the first place. One that sees clearly, thinks accurately, and stops being manipulated by situations, by other people, and by its own assumptions. That's what critical thinking mastery is about. Not logic puzzles or debate tactics, but the actual mental habits that separate people who react from people who respond. People who get used from people who see it coming. If this video moved something in you, that one will sharpen it. And if you don't want to lose it when it drops, you already know what to do.